Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Chartered Bankers webinar on recognising vulnerability during these uncertain times. Whether you're watching live or recorded, you're very welcome. We have pulled together a very experienced panel to talk around some of the key issues that fall from the guidance recently circulated by the FCA. Let me first introduce myself. I'm Paul Denton. I am a fellow of the Chartered Banking Institute. I've been a member for nearly 30 years, and I also am the Chief Executive of Scottish Building Society. So I've been involved in financial services for around 30 years, and clearly this is a hugely important topic area, and one that's become increasingly so over the course of recent years. So who'd have thought that we'd have seen all of the changes that have occurred over the course of the last year, and we don't need to be reminded with regards to the impact that it's had on all of our lives, but equally perhaps more so on some of the more vulnerable of our customers, and indeed employees within financial services. The consultation paper that came out from the FCA follows on from the previous papers, which we discussed in a webinar from October of last year. But for the purpose of today, we're going to focus around the themes that have come through around recognising vulnerability and responding to customers' needs, the value of sympathy, the importance of empowered and knowledgeable staff, and addressing communication needs. And to that, I referenced earlier the panel that we'd pulled together. Firstly, I'm pleased to say that we have Vanda Goldvag, who is the chair of the Financial Services Consumer Panel. We have Valentine Mulholland, who's the Senior Policy Manager with Money Advice and Pension Service. Paul Barrett, the Head of Wellbeing for the Bank Workers Charity. And Joanna Finlay, who is currently with Virgin Money, but is also a previous Young Banker of the Year and speaks passionately with regards to vulnerable customers. So welcome to all of our panel. Just before we go into some of the topics, just a little bit of my own experience of vulnerability, and two things really that spring to mind. One, there is no doubt that throughout our lives there will be periods where all of us are vulnerable at some point or other. I myself have experienced bereavement within the family. I have equally been through a divorce in the past, both of which I'm sure perhaps not admitted at the time, but would have left me more vulnerable than normal. But equally, I took a spell out of financial services and I worked as the managing director of Co-op Funeral Care. Believe you me, you really truly understand vulnerable when every single customer interaction is of a vulnerable nature, and financial services, whilst moving forward at a considerable pace to help improve the experience and better understand vulnerable, can certainly learn from other industries that are out there across the UK, and I point towards the previous career opportunity that I experienced myself. So to that, let's move to some of the questions, and as we do, I will ask the panel perhaps just to give a little bit more background to themselves as they introduce their thoughts and comments. So let me start with our first discussion topic. We left last year's discussion wondering if there was a better term to be used than vulnerable, which perhaps puts too much emphasis on the person rather than the circumstances. And clearly the experience of the last 6 months has given us a lot of food for thought with regards to that particular aspect, and perhaps more how we can better and more consistently describe and recognise customers who are in a vulnerable circumstance. And maybe I'll come to Vanda first of all, if you don't mind, Vanda, and perhaps you could give us a bit more background to yourself and then your thoughts with regards to should we be looking at more of the circumstance rather than the individual? Vanda, I think perhaps you're on mute.
Well, that's a good start, isn't it? I'm Vanda Goldbach and I don't know where my mute button is. I'm chair of the Financial Services Consumer Panel, as you said, but I actually am a plural non-exec, and I work in a number of areas where vulnerability is also quite important. I'm a non-exec director of a very big hospital group in London called the Royal Free, and I'm also an associate non-exec at a smaller hospital that does a lot of community work called the Whittington. And I have 2 or 3 other roles. I have a role in the gas industry, and I also appoint Queen's Counsel. So what it means is that I have access to things that are happening in healthcare, happening in the legal world, and in financial services. And so it's not unique to financial services that we have people who are vulnerable. I was, for some years, chair of the Legal Ombudsman, the body you go to when you think a solicitor or a barrister has not behaved in your best interest. And some of the vulnerability there is extraordinary. If someone has done something wrong with a will, you could go from being a very wealthy and healthy person to someone who's in a great deal of difficulty. You might be losing the home you've lived in for 30 years because a will has been mishandled. So I think it's attractive to think about circumstances as well as individuals, but there are some things that make you vulnerable all the time. So for example, if you're deaf, in a world in which people want to ring you up or they want you to be on Zoom meetings, then being deaf is quite difficult, particularly in a world in which when you're going out of the house, most people are wearing masks. So there are some people who are vulnerable by the nature of a disability, for example, or because of mental health issues, or because of age, or because of their ability to move around, or to use a laptop, for example. So I don't think we want to detract from that group of people as well. But in terms of circumstances, you're absolutely right. And Paul, you mentioned a couple just then. You mentioned bereavement and you mentioned divorce. I'm aware of other circumstances. You know, your parent, one of your 2 elderly parents dies, the other one can't live alone. You've suddenly got to find sheltered housing for them. That's a situation in which anyone can become unbelievably vulnerable and can make very bad decisions. So I think what I would say is we don't want to move from vulnerable people to vulnerable circumstances. We want to be aware of both factors. Paul, you've now done it. You're on mute.
My God, the wonder of modern technology. You think we'd be used to it after the year that we've had. I couldn't agree more, actually, and it absolutely is to do with the individual and the circumstances. But Valentine, if I could bring you in, if you don't mind, and perhaps again you could just offer us a little bit of intro to yourself.
Thank you. Yes. So I work for the Money and Pension Service that many of you will know as our previous organisations, the Money Advice Service, PensionWise and the Pension Advisory Service. And when we were created as the Money and Pension Service in January 2019, for the first time, government in setting us up required that we focus on those in vulnerable circumstances, that we kind of particularly ensure that we meet the needs in terms of money guidance, pensions guidance, and the commissioning of debt advice on those people. And so we spent quite a long time trying to understand, in relation to those issues, who is vulnerable. And we actually came to a conclusion that to a large extent, the Financial Conduct Authority's definition is appropriate, with one exception for us, but which is that people are vulnerable because they've got a personal characteristic, and that can be a lot less transient. And I think Wanda makes the good point that some aspects of some characteristics you're going to be vulnerable in relation to financial services on an ongoing basis. But the impact of life events is also critical in relation to financial well-being. And I think we've not seen that quite as aptly demonstrated as we have since the COVID crisis. So we know that those who've been more impacted by COVID, those who've been more financially impacted by COVID, some groups that we hadn't particularly been focused on previously. So people who are self-employed, and that people with mental health problems had existing issues in some people with mental health problems in relation to financial services, but that's actually exacerbated, and also that group has grown. And the third group, and I'm glad that again Wanda has made reference to that as well, is we also recognise that in relation to financial services, the skills to engage with your money and pensions are also, if you don't have those skills, will mean that you might be vulnerable. And digital inclusion has been a key aspect of that. I think the move, you know, we know there's been a massive increase in the number of people who are engaging with online banking since the pandemic. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily know how to protect themselves. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's kind of aware of some of the risks. So we have seen the fact that we do need to talk about vulnerable circumstances because they're transient, and because we have people who've been made more vulnerable as a result of the pandemic than they would have been previously. And we've just published last week, we're developing at the moment the UK strategy for financial well-being to look by 2030 at what needs to happen so that people are better able to manage their money and pensions. And as an interim, the chairs of the groups that we've set up to look at all our goals across the UK strategy have published a report saying what needs to happen in the short term to overcome the financial disadvantage created by COVID-19. And one thing that they're saying to banks and firms is actually you need to recognise that there are new vulnerabilities created by COVID-19, and you need to ensure that your services are agile enough to recognise those vulnerabilities and to treat those people as being in vulnerable circumstances that you might not have thought of before. Self-employed is a good example. We know that BAME people have been overrepresented in some of the most at-risk sectors in the pandemic. So you might need to look at all those kind of issues in terms of looking at who might be struggling in your customer base financially.
I listening to both of your answers. It prompts me. I was involved with the FCA when Vulnerable first came out back in 2015, and it prompts me back to conversations that we had with regards to customers who are of a more permanent vulnerable position versus those that are thrust in because of circumstance. And I, back then, and I probably haven't shifted my view, is that those customers who, let's say, live with vulnerability on a permanent basis often have a support framework around them, either by family or a real acceptance of the circumstances that they have, versus those that are find themselves in what's referred to as a temporary vulnerable position because of the circumstances, whose day-to-day life may have been going on as normal, and all of a sudden an event or otherwise lands on them. They're hugely confused. They don't necessarily know where to go for support or advice. And taking the COVID situation, often there is just so many different messages out there that the messages themselves, beyond the event that people find themselves in, are confusing and add further to that vulnerability. So very, very interesting times. That we are clearly as a sector trying to work through this. And let me take us on to another discussion topic, and I'm sure we'll come back to the first one as we do. But through the recent pandemic, it's had an impact on many people's personal and professional lives. And one of the outcomes that the FCA would like to see, as we would all, is that we show a greater level of sympathy or perhaps empathy, depending on how it's viewed sometimes. But how might individuals, particularly those who are working within financial services, how can they support both themselves and customers? And Paul, let me come to you for a view on this. And again, if you could introduce yourself and your background as well, please, Paul.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Paul. My name's Paul Barrett, and I'm the Head of Wellbeing for the Bank Workers Charity. And for those of you that have not encountered us before, the charity has as its primary purpose maintaining good health and well-being among the banking community. And that means people who are current bank employees, but indeed means anybody who's ever worked in the profession. So it could be somebody in the 1990s that transitioned through banking to other professions, and of course pensioners as well. And the way that we do that is essentially in two ways. On the one hand, to provide services to help bank employees that have gotten into difficulty of one form or another, and that might be in the form of counselling, it might be in the form of financial support, it might be helping carers or people with disabilities, in large part helping vulnerable people or people who've got themselves into a vulnerable circumstance. The other side, which is much more my role, is I'm an organisational psychologist by trade, and I work closely with a major, well, not just the major UK banks, but with UK banks in the development of their wellbeing strategies. And that means, amongst other things, trying to identify emerging wellbeing trends. A good example of that is financial wellbeing, which few banks were treating seriously 2 or 3 years ago. It's now become probably, certainly alongside mental health, the biggest wellbeing priority for most banks. We write white papers on different wellbeing themes, usually emerging wellbeing themes like the impact of digital technology on health and wellbeing. And one of the things that I've observed as I work closely with banks is the extent to which banks are now grappling with financial wellbeing, and particularly the impact of financial well-being on their own workforce. Now, 5 years ago, nobody was paying attention to that. But if we're looking at vulnerabilities now, I think, obviously, we think very carefully about the vulnerability of customers. We need to think also about the vulnerability of our own workforces, because 2 of the UK banks did internal surveys, 2 of them that I'm in contact with, that found 1 in 4 of their own employees felt that their finances were in a very precarious position. And there was a neighbour survey recently that found, well, it was 2019, 50% of UK employees are having to borrow money to fund day-to-day living expenses. So there are far more perhaps vulnerable people out there than we'd previously appreciated. So as a charity, we provide support, often in the form of financial provision to people like that. So we've got those 2 strands to what we do, helping the banks to become better at supporting the well-being of their workforce, but helping bank employees individually. Now, if we move to the subject that you raised, Paul, I mean, you started off by talking about sympathy. I think you're right. Lots of us tend to think as empathy is the more relevant circumstance when we're thinking about vulnerable customers. And I think banks have done a great deal to, in the form of training and workshops, to look at how frontline staff can have a more empathic approach toward their customers, and particularly kind of walking in their shoes, understanding the various things that are affecting their circumstances from their perspective. And I think that's the way you get the best outcomes for the customers themselves. What else can banks do? I think I've mentioned already the kind of impact of financial well-being, but there are other vulnerabilities among the workforce themselves. Many bank employees experience mental health problems. In the pandemic, lots of experienced loneliness. And I think it's something that the banks themselves can utilize as they're devising training courses for frontline staff to support vulnerable customers, to actually utilize that lived experience of the bank employees that have been through these very difficult experiences. You know, many households have had people that are on furlough, partners that are on furlough, maybe in some cases redundancies. So they've had that direct experience themselves. That could be involved, that could be vital in helping in the development of future training courses, so that frontline staff in the future get properly trained in understanding the circumstances of vulnerable customers. I think the final thing is most of the banks have made tackling mental health a strategic priority in the last 5 years. And what that's mean is very large numbers of staff have been trained in understanding and recognizing the signs of poor mental health, but also in having difficult conversations. And I think if you can combine that mix of lived experience that we've seen through the pandemic on frontline staff, together with the training that's been had pretty widespread across the sector, then we have the potential to have a really strong frontline force that's able to ensure that customers get the best outcomes.
Well, thank you. You raised some excellent points, and actually in preparation for the webinar and looking through some of the discussion topics, thinking about our colleagues, and this is a webinar for the Chartered Banking Institute, so many who will be listening in are clearly involved within financial services, but it really struck home for me and recalled back to the start of the pandemic, whereby colleagues myself at Scottish Building Society, and I know from speaking to ex-colleagues from elsewhere, really experienced a difficult time, as being, many were key workers. They were coming in, they were experiencing pressure from families at the initial part of the lockdown, people uneasy because financial workers weren't necessarily seen as key workers as NHS colleagues are, etc. There was a lot of pressure on colleagues, but equally through that period, whilst we've been very fortunate as an industry in that many of us have been kept exceptionally busy through this period, we should never lose sight that many people who work within the financial services industry have got family and friends who have very much been impacted by the pandemic, and of course that brings pressure perhaps on household incomes that was already there, as you touched on earlier. So not forgetting the employees within financial services is hugely key. And to that, let me turn to Joanna. Joanna, thank you for joining us, and clearly very much working within financial services. Do you want to just give us a little bit of background and then your thoughts on the topic?
Sure, thanks, Paul. So I'm a Sustainable Banking Manager at Virgin Money. I have been here and Virgin Money, various roles in strategy, product development, Northern Rock before that, Barclays before that. My role is around the vulnerable customer strategy and all colleague training on how to best support vulnerable customers, but my particular focus is on inclusive design, so how we can design product, services and communications that give frontline colleagues the solutions to offer to customers and enable customers to self-help. So the way that I see my role is to consider who is left out or left behind by traditional banking services, and then consider what we can strategically do about that. And my number one passion is financial inclusion and affordable credit. So yeah, in terms of the question of, I sort of fiercely agree with everything that's been said so far, in terms of how we can learn from, benefit from the potential experiences our colleagues may have gone through. I absolutely agree with empathy rather than sympathy. Simply feeling sorry for someone, I don't think is powerful enough. The way that I would define empathy is to walk in their shoes and to walk alongside them. So say, like, we will get through this, rather than I'm sorry that you are going through that. So if I may, I've thought about the question in two ways, in terms of how colleagues may have been impacted and what the benefits or otherwise might be of that for customers living through vulnerable circumstances. And I suppose I'd like to flip it into a question, which would be, how would you spot if a colleague was struggling, and how has that changed as a result of working from home or living in this sort of 2D world? How proactive are you at having FaceTime coffees, and how good would you be at seeing beyond the veneer? It's very easy to have a game face for a 30 or 60-minute call, and you may not notice so readily if somebody is looking really flat at their desk, or just having a moment by the water cooler where it's clear that something is wrong. So how would you spot if a colleague was struggling? And it's amazing to hear from Paul about the support that is available through the Bank Workers Charity, but I guess most people need to be encouraged to access that help. So as I said, I think there's two ways of answering the question of the impact of COVID on colleagues and what the impact of that could be on our response to vulnerable customers. And the first is more idealistic. Nietzsche would say that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so I guess we'd hope that if people have been through difficult circumstances due to COVID, that it would somehow make them stronger. And we would hope that it would give them the gift of empathy, and that having lived through those difficult circumstances, they would more readily identify with customers going through those, whether in serving them or in the way that they think about designing products, services and communications. So I think that's the idealistic view. I think it's idealistic because it assumes that the impact is over and that they have indeed overcome it. To your point previously about how we can learn about these experiences, I run a financial inclusion panel at Virgin Money, so colleagues with lived experience of vulnerabilities come anonymously and share the experiences that they've been through. And I'm going to have to draw my pyramid for you. You see, we always talk about the impact on life, the impact on money, and then the impact on banking. Because I think too often we start with our banking processes and what we need to do to help people through our policies, processes, products, etc. But I think really to convert experience into empathy, you need to understand the impact on life first, because banking, we should have the humility to accept we're a tiny part of people's lives, and therefore people aren't going to come to it with a load of energy and enthusiasm for adapting to our way of doing things. So to answer the question on how firms can therefore make the most of that or change to make the most of it, it would simply be more proactive in enabling those stories to be heard and to have an impact. But as I say, that's probably the simple answer, and it's perhaps the one that we'd be more comfortable with. I think we might need to take a step back and acknowledge that the impact is not short term, and colleagues may not have overcome the impact on their personal and professional lives. And they may not soon either. And so they may not be ready to convert their newfound empathy, this gift of empathy, into improving our services. I listened to a really interesting podcast recently in which an endurance athlete and a UK GP discussed the difference between the acute and the chronic impacts of COVID. And to me, it really helped to just clarify what was already in my head, which is everything that we're hearing on the public health front is about saving lives. It's about avoiding the spread of the virus. And I just wonder whether there's too much focus on not losing lives and not enough on the potential loss of household income, loss of jobs, loss of support networks, loss of financial control, and loss of sanity. And all those of you who are well familiar with the FCA's table of drivers of vulnerability, they are all drivers of vulnerability. As has already been said, mental health, I think, is going to be the biggest chronic disease that comes out of this period. And anyone with pre-existing vulnerabilities, especially low confidence with managing money, will be the worst off. I heard a quote from Emily Maitlis. This is from the beginning of April, if I might just share this. She said, this disease is not a great leveller. She was disputing what Boris Johnson's office had said about it. And the consequences of which everyone, rich and poor, suffers the same. It is not. This is a myth that needs debunking. Those who've been on the front line are disproportionately the lower paid members of our workforce. They are more likely to catch the disease as they're more exposed. Those who live in tower blocks and small flats will find lockdown harder. This is a health issue with huge ramifications for social welfare, and it's a welfare issue with huge ramifications for public health. And I just wonder whether so far banks' response to COVID has been the acute, and we're not even engaging with the chronic yet. And I would say that, as Paul was saying, our workforces are simply a reflection of the whole of society. Many of us may have the luxury of working from home, or if not living, working in comfortable offices, but we too have people working on minimum wage. We too have people on the front line who are more exposed. And if I may, I just share a personal example. So my husband was made redundant last Thursday, and let me tell you, I wasn't firing on all cylinders on Friday. It's very difficult to focus when you are staring into anxiety gnawing at your mind. Because I happen to be a cap money budgeting coach, I spent Saturday reworking our budget to live on half our income. And we'll be okay, but I think we're probably in the minority. And as I said, I think it's so good that the Bank Workers Charity is offering that help, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. that the Money and Pension Service is looking at this strategy for financial capability and well-being, and it's very encouraging that more banks are engaging with the financial capability and well-being of their own people. But I don't think we should reassure ourselves that it's all in place now and that we're ready to simply convert all this experience into empathy. I don't think we are. I think we're in the chronic phase of this illness. And so I would ask again, would you notice if a colleague was struggling? Would you know how to signpost them to help? How likely do you think it is that they're ready to convert that into empathy in terms of how we serve our customers?
I think you raised some really good points, and a topic that we could discuss potentially for years to come is that the focus, rightly or wrongly, has been very much a short-term health versus a long-term economy. But the reality is that there is the short-term health, but there's the long-term health here that plays through versus the economic aspects as well. But very, very interesting, and one we'll come back to for a long time to come, I'm sure. I'm conscious of time, and I'll move us on to very clearly a related subject, because it also has become apparent through COVID as more people are using digital, as more people are spending time online and perhaps doing things to fill their time because they've no other social way out. That things have come to the fore, such as gambling, online gambling, and there's more fraud, financial abuse, etc., occurring online. What more do we think we can be doing? These things were always there in the background, but perhaps COVID and the circumstances have accelerated these and brought them even more to the fore. But what could we be doing to protect vulnerable customers in these circumstances? And Valentine, if I can come back to yourself, please, and take your thoughts on that.
Thank you. I think the most immediate thing that springs to mind, and this is part of what we're driving towards with the UK strategy for financial well-being, is early identification of problems. And I know individually, like, I'm delighted that Paul is saying that a lot of banks are focusing on inclusion by design. And I know individual banks and institutions are looking at early identification, but particularly banks, compared to the rest of financial services, if you've got somebody's main account, you've got visibility of the kind of sums coming in and out of their accounts. And I think the potential to use data to proactively identify potential harm is really significant, and it's a really difficult issue. And I'm talking to a room full of bankers, and I'm not one. And I know that there are GDPR issues, and I know that there are consumer appetite issues. Barclays did some work a couple of years ago looking at to what extent consumers were prepared to see their bank using their data to come back to them and offer wider support, and it's quite limited. But I think when we can see, so economic abuse is a massively growth in awareness. It's not new, economic abuse. It's a really important part of domestic abuse, of elder abuse. But it's something that we're becoming much clearer about. So surviving economic abuse, the charity has done a lot of work. But there's some real clear indicators, both in conversations but in data, that somebody might actually be being controlled and making decisions that look inappropriate. And for gambling, we have indeed seen, unfortunately, an increase in online gambling at the same time as gambling in person has been hit. And what's really worrying is that 18 to 25s have been particularly hit, both by COVID, but also by the marketing of gambling sites. So there are real opportunities, and I'm really, really keen to see banks use those opportunities and be a bit more brave. I know the compliance people in your organizations are often very reluctant to go near that, but just to be a bit more brave and to actually, you've got amazing capabilities and algorithmic skills, and the technology is there. And colleagues I have who've worked in banking say banks have that information, and there just needs to be a stronger appetite. Now, I think the FCA's draft guidance for on the treatment of vulnerable consumers doesn't go far enough, I don't think, to talk about identification. And I've said in a meeting with UK Finance that I think that the new guidance is driving firms to do more to identify vulnerability, and UK Finance have sort of disagreed with me in the semantics of how that's positioned, and are very reluctant to do that. But I think there's a real opportunity to use data a lot more constructively. And just one final point before I hand over to a colleague is that on authorized push payment fraud and the contingent reimbursement model, I'm really uncomfortable that that's a voluntary code. You know, regulating something which is a high risk for consumers, giving consumers confidence that they'll be protected from those kind of risks. It needs to be a code that all banking services operate. It should be a requirement of all banks, not just the main ones, so that people recognize what they're dealing with when they get, you know, recognize what their protections are. Because people are with challenger banks who are not offering that, then they don't necessarily know they're not covered. So I think that, you know, voluntary agreements are great, but actually consumers need regulatory certainty.
To pick up on your earlier point, there's no doubt that the banks have the capability to interrogate the data because it's done for the purpose of anti-money laundering, for fraud, for financial difficulty. So this isn't about the interrogation, it is that next step of what do we do with that? How do we intervene? How do you avoid intrusion whilst providing support through? So there's no question that the capability is there. It's the willingness to take the next step is a key point. Vanda, can I come to you for your view on this, please?
Well, I wanted to say about what Valentine has just said. Yes, I totally agree. And in almost every aspect, I think she has a point. But let's start with the voluntary code issue. I don't mind voluntary codes if they work, but this one isn't working. And that's the problem. If an industry, let's take the drinks industry. I think the whole Drinks Aware Portman Group process has worked. But for whatever reason, some of the voluntary codes in the financial services sector aren't working. And one of the things that really upsets me is that in every one of these frauds, there is a receiving bank. If the consequences for the receiving bank were as dangerous as they are for the sending bank, then quite a lot of this would go away. But for some reason, someone can steal money, send it from my bank account to another bank account and straight on to the Cayman Islands, and the bank that allowed that to happen has no consequences. So of course they don't take it very seriously. So I would like the voluntary code to be compulsory, and if we can't get that soon, I'd like it to be that the receiving bank has as much responsibility for rescuing the situation. I mean, if they had to pay, you know, if I'm defrauded out of £1,000, if the bank that sent it pays 500 back to me and the one that received it paid back 500, you know, some of this would go away almost overnight. In terms of gambling and other things, there is a very, very difficult line. I chaired a self-regulator within the gambling industry for a couple of years called Senate. We're the ones who created that campaign, When the Fun Stops, Stop. And what I was always trying to do was to get to people like banks and credit card companies who could see harm was happening. Now, occasionally, so much harm is happening that an individual goes to their credit card company and says, please block me from, you know, Paddy Power, William Hill, and so on. And then the bank will do something about it. But actually, of course, what happens to compulsive gamblers is as soon as they get blocked, they start using more and more obscure sites. And banks never wanted to be part of that process because they argued that data protection laws and so on made it very difficult for them. Well, as we all know, we can waive our rights. I could waive my rights to Joanna today. I could say, Joanna, I've got a gambling problem. You own my bank account. I give you permission to interfere because I'm incapable of doing it myself. But nobody is interested in doing that because it's difficult. It has to be done on an individual basis, and there are no processes for it. And then what would happen to Joanna and Virgin or whoever she works for at the time if I managed to sneak a 10 quid bet somewhere else? So I'm not saying it isn't complicated, and I'm not saying there are legislative problems with it, but actually with will, you can do these things. And overall, when someone who is vulnerable comes to a financial services company and says, I need this help, what financial services companies tend to do is say, oh, this is dreadfully awkward, or they fold their arms in front of their thing, or they say, well, we can't just do individual cases. If they started from the approach, well, gosh, man, your request is very difficult. Let's think about the 3 or 4 ways we might help you. That would be a very different approach. I also want to briefly talk about this whole issue around staff handling, empathy, and so on. So I think we can all agree that a large number of people had credit card payments for things they didn't get, theatre tickets, airline tickets, and so on. And so there was a lot of what we call Section 75 requests going on. Most of the major banks had quite rightly said that they didn't want their call centres inundated with those sorts of issues. They wanted to be able to talk to vulnerable customers. And so they created other systems for you to register that you had a credit card refund request, like chat lines and like digital approaches, most of which were overwhelmed and stopped working. I mean, several big banks were offline for several days on their chat line facility because they were designed to have X thousand chats a day and they were having blah, X times chats. So it's not just about identifying there's a problem. I think almost all the big high street banks realized, and credit card companies realized, there was going to be people asking for refunds, but none of them could get their systems up and running fast enough. And, when they did finally reopen their call centers, what you had was very, very angry customers ringing very conscientious staff who were at home who had nowhere to offload on. I mean, if you sit in a call center and you get someone screaming at you, you could say, I'm not here to be screamed at. There's a whole policy. But when you get off the phone, you could turn to your colleague and say, oh, God, she was awful. I was so upset. But if you're at home, you can't do that. And so that whole circle is not working. Very angry customers talking to very pressurized bank staff, often at home and unsupported. And
if I can play the banker within this, and I do agree with the points that you make, particularly with regards to the unsupported staff and the capacity that was there to deal with the volume of calls that came through at an unprecedented pace. But equally, they also came through with regards to mortgage deferrals, bounce back loans, unsecured payment holidays, etc., where the financial services industry did a huge effort to support all consumers rather than even just the vulnerable consumers at breakneck speed and at huge volumes. So that's not an excuse, but just a statement of reality that we'll all look back to April and May of 2020 and frankly say, how on earth did we get through that? But some really good points. Let me, because I am conscious of time, let me just move on to our next topic. And the similar to the second discussion point that we had, and perhaps we're not seeing the full long-term effect of COVID as yet. The government support, which has been hugely welcomed, but it has delayed the true impact to the economy and therefore the true impact to consumers. And we're certainly going to see some fresh challenges come through for financial services in 21 as the real impact of that starts to flow through. How can financial services employees and employers prepare themselves for the next wave of impact rather than the next wave of health issue? And Paul, maybe I can come to yourself on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the challenges, two things immediately spring to mind. One is banks have responded, I think, incredibly well to the challenges faced by the changing sets of consumer needs, particularly from the vulnerable customers. New products, new approaches. I think the challenge is going to be in a pandemic that shows no sign of drawing to a close. We're going to be faced with constantly evolving situations that are going to require, in turn, more responses from banks. And I think to keep on doing that is going to be difficult. but I think it's going to be a necessary thing for us to do. I think the other really important thing, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear me focusing on this, is, I've just acknowledged that banks are doing really well in responding to customer needs, and I think they are. But just as importantly, we can't forget that staff are affected by the pandemic just as much, and often in very similar ways. So there has to be an unerring focus on the well-being of employees, many of whom are still working from home, many of whom we've touched on already are suffering financial difficulties. Joanne referred to the almost certain increase in mental health problems. So well-being has to maintain, banks are doing good stuff around well-being. I'm very aware of that through my contacts with them. But particularly with the home working population, many of them are working in suboptimal living circumstances. It's not easy, and we need to continue to revise our well-being programs and strategies to make sure that our staff are in good shape, because if they're trying to support other people, they can only do that if their own well-being is good. And again, Joanne I think very movingly gave an example of how her own day-to-day functioning had been impacted by changes affected by the pandemic for her. I think if we look specifically at the way that the pandemic has affected the role of people that are servicing vulnerable customers, how much harder must it be, and it's always hard, dealing with high-risk cases when you're at home compared to when you have the traditional systems that are available in the workplace. If you're dealing with a suicidal customer within the four walls of your home, you have to have really well thought through support systems and check-ins in place. And I think that is a really important part of what we need to have available alongside all of the broader well-being stuff. Are we equipping our people and supporting them in extremely demanding circumstances? And I think that has to be the priority for banks alongside all the other stuff. I know we have to focus on customers, but they will only get their right outcomes for the customer if we're doing right by our people.
I couldn't agree more. And Joanna, there is almost a sense of we've done well to support through 2020, but can everybody dust yourself down, because here we go again into 2021, whether it's the second wave of health or whether it's the unravelling of the government schemes and the impacts that will bring, etc. Your thoughts on how we can motivate our colleagues through that?
Yeah, well, I suppose, as Paul says, it's about having these regular check-ins. I think for a while we were sort of in crisis state, and we were just getting our heads down and doing what we had to do to work through this. In my own team, we've established, it feels a bit more restrictive, like not restrictive, but it's extra routine. But every 9:30 every morning we get on a video chat. We primarily talk about how we're feeling, which feels a bit awkward for some people, but I think you just have to, I can't keep an eye on people. I can't have water cooler chats. I can't say, oh, do you want to come for a walk around the block with me if I think someone's having a bad day? So I think it's just about being more intentional, more proactive.
Yeah, absolutely. So
the practical thing that I think everyone can do is we are all now living in these worlds where we have a meeting starting at 2 and ending at 3. So actually starting it at 5 to 2 and having a little chat. And the chat can be exactly the sort of chat you used to have in the office, my team has done this, oh, did you see the grandkids this weekend? So, and not making that a bad thing, the reality is when we used to go to meetings in person, we used to have a little 5-minute chat both ends, either as we walked towards the meeting or as we went away from the meeting. Because we agenda our time now, we feel we shouldn't do that, but I'm actually doing this deliberately. I'm setting meetings at slightly off the hour and things, and in that last 5 minutes, well, that first 5 minutes, there's an I start by saying, well, God, this is what I did for the weekend. Did anyone actually manage to get out? And we have a little chat about it. And one of the things that you can pick up in that circumstance is someone who says, no, I couldn't do anything. And you think, oh, well, that sounds like a bit, you don't address it there and then, but you pick up a nuance in exactly the same way as Joanna would have picked it up a nuance if she was in the office with that person.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great bit of best practice, just taking that time, because you're right, and I found myself guilty of it, you know, just moving from one Zoom or Teams call to the other, and not actually taking the time for the social intervention that would have occurred as you gathered in the room, so to speak, previously. So I'm conscious we have attendees, and we have a Q&A that's open. So as I put our last question to our panelists, if anybody has anything that they would like to raise, please feel free to use the questions and answers. But equally, any questions that we don't answer will ensure that are picked up by the Institute going forward. So to our last topic, and it's broader than perhaps just the impact of COVID of late, which has clearly dominated the conversation. But within the draft guidance for the fair treatment of vulnerable customers, the FCA mentions the importance of knowledge and training. And if I could perhaps guide us past COVID, which for obvious reasons dominates all of our conversations these days, but thinking beyond that, what skills and behaviours do you think we still need by individuals to better the outcomes for customers? And Valentine, if I could maybe come to Vander, if I could maybe come to yourself on that one, please.
Well, the first thing I have to say is that I'm extremely worried that actually all of this is moving us into a much more digital world. And in a much more digital world, those nuances of personalization become very much more difficult. So I'm a great fan of digital. I do my banking digitally. I do, you know, enormous amount. I book my own travel digitally and so on. But first of all, I need to remember that other people can't always do that. And secondly, if you're forced down a form, it must have happened to you yourself. The form says, do you want X or Y? And the answer is, no, I want a nuance of that. And there's absolutely no way of being able to say that. So I think back to the inclusive design thing that a number of us have talked about. One of the pieces of inclusive design we're going to need is that if we are driving everyone, as many people as we can, into a digital world, the form must allow for some free form, or I know I ticked X above, but that's because you didn't ask me Z, and that's what I actually want. And then you need staff who are looking at that material to say, oh, I know if you tick button 7, you get this product, but actually I could see in the free form that the woman said, actually I only ticked that because I couldn't do anything else, and I'm really interested in this. And you need people to able to intervene. Now, if it's not digital, it's the same principle. We're all scripted, and financial services is just as guilty as this as everybody else. Script. You need people who have the skills to spot that someone is pushing against the script, actually doesn't want to answer in that way. And you want them to be able to spot the people who aren't comfortable with the script and who need assistance in a different way, I think.
And I would build on that as well, in that you need to have the environment where colleagues feel empowered, that they can move away from the script. And one of the many things that I've seen, both within banking and within the funeral care, unfortunately, we are regulated industries, and we almost impose down through the culture that we follow rules for the benefit of the customers, that almost takes colleagues away from feeling that sometimes they can step outside of those rules. And it's very much around the culture and how people feel empowered through that. Joanna, any thoughts on that from your perspective?
And I can see questions coming in, so I'm going to give this a really quick answer so we can get to some of those as well. I think it's about head and heart, and by that I mean we can fill colleagues' heads with knowledge about vulnerabilities. I would hope that we focus on impact on life, impact on money, and impact on banking. But unless we encourage colleagues to engage their hearts as well, then I don't think we really have hit home on how we can best support vulnerable customers. So I think it's about turning compassion into action and ensuring that colleagues on the front line know what they are allowed to do and say, but also know who else can offer even more than that within the business and externally. And I think all that is pretty much covered by the guidance. The thing that I'm most focused on is inclusive design, which has been mentioned many times. And again, I think it's not about having a head full of knowledge about vulnerabilities. I think it's about a change of heart. It's about an attitude change and really grasping that what's good for customers is good for the business. So if you make banking easier for those who particularly struggle, it becomes beautiful for everyone else. It creates more efficient, more engaging processes. It enables banking to become a tiny part of life rather than a massive frustration. Mm-hmm. So I think it's more about an attitudinal change. Once we've crammed everyone's heads full of knowledge about vulnerabilities, we need to engage hearts as well, because otherwise it's never going to translate into services that improve life for people who are feeling and thinking and doing beings.
Indeed, indeed. We have had a number of questions through, so thank you for that. I'll certainly take a few before we draw the conclusion here. Valentine, maybe I can put one to yourself. The question that's come in is with regards to requesting formal repayment of debt going forward. There's clearly going to be circumstances where people are going to be in financial difficulty, particularly going back to the earlier question, as we step away from government schemes. How can we ensure that we are fair to customers in a vulnerable position, showing empathy, etc., whilst there clearly is a need for us to apply forbearance going forward?
So I think that's a really good question, because we're coming to the end of some of the payment deferrals, and we're coming to a point where some people, as a result, will have built up an accumulation of debt. Some people will have taken a deferral, others will just have borrowed more, and we're in a position where some people will be facing very significant repayments and trying to assess whether somebody's in a position to repay. Now, we were delighted by the guidance that the FCA issued about the end of payment deferrals and what firms should do. And one of the things they've made really clear is that firms should establish what position somebody is still in, because some people are going to be in the position where they can go back to making payments. They've had a financial shock. But even those who are back in work, some of them will not be able to take on the whole amount of the debt that they've now incurred over the period that was originally intended. So it is about having those individual conversations, but it is also, and I would say this, but urging people, firms, to signpost people to money guidance, or if it already looks like they're simply unable to make repayments, to debt advice. But money guidance is also really helpful. And one of the things that the FCA are asking banks to do, which, you know, we've been in discussions with them, is to look at somebody's whole financial situation. So if they owe you this much money and you're saying, well, we know what income you've got coming in, you should be in a position to be able to pay us off. You don't know what other forbearance they may have taken out, what other credit they've built up. And so I think the FCA is saying, take into account somebody's whole situation, look at a standard financial statement, an income and expenditure statement, look at their financial situation, and look at whether you can signpost them to independent help. But also, you cannot, according to the FCA's new guidance, just set repayment arrangements as you would have done a year ago. You have to really take into account their own circumstances.
I absolutely, and I think that's a great point for us to just wrap things up there as we approach the top of the hour. Whenever you get to the end of a meeting and you know you could go on, it usually comes down to one of two things. The meeting has either been incredibly poorly chaired, or this is a fantastically topical discussion that could have gone on far longer. I'm going to go with the second, but that's the privilege of the chair. I would like to put a heartfelt thank you out to the panelists who have spoke with great passion and clearly with great knowledge and experience. So thank you to all four of you. It's very much appreciated, certainly from myself as chair, but equally on behalf of the Chartered Banker Institute as well. A big thank you to all those that have attended. I offer an apology that we've not been able to take all of the questions, but I can let you know that we're keeping a note of all of those questions, and if you watch through the Institute's website, we'll ensure that we follow up on this. And I'll probably go a little further to say that I'm sure there'll be follow-up webinars off the back of this, because clearly we haven't reached the end of this the topic, and if we're honest, we probably haven't reached the end of the start of this topic. So thank you very much again. Have a good day, everybody, and that's the close of the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.